Welcome to Agentic Data. My name is Joseph Moon, your host. I'm the CEO of Oxygen Intelligence. And today, let's talk about one topic that's been catching everybody's attention on X. And that topic is the topic of context graphs. So Jaya Gupta, who's a partner at Foundation Capital, has written a beautiful piece on her take on context graphs. And I think this really resonated with a lot of folks in technology. And we have also been thinking about context graphs for quite a long time in various different ways, spanning from more structured context graphs in the form of semantic layers and ontologies, as well as more loosely defined context layers that are more trace centric, more observability and trace centric, more machine learning centric than ontology centric. And so let's unravel a bit here and just have a think about this topic and related concepts for our own understanding. So let me read this article for you. This article is entitled AI's Trillion Dollar Opportunity Context Graphs. The last generation of enterprise software created a trillion-dollar ecosystem by becoming systems of record. Salesforce for customers, Workday for employees, SAP for operations. Own the canonical data, own the workflow, own the lock-in. The debate right now is whether those systems survive the shift to agents. Jamin Ball's recent post, Long Live Systems of Record, hit a nerve. Pushing back on the agents kill everything narrative, he argues that agents don't replace systems of record. They raise the bar for what a good one looks like. We agree. Agents are cross-system and action-oriented. The UX of work is separating from the underlying data plane. Agents become the interface, but something still has to be canonical underneath. Where we go further is this. Ball's framing assumes the data agents need already live somewhere, and agents just need better access to it, plus better governance, semantic contracts, and explicit rules about which definition wins for which purpose. That's half the picture. The other half is the missing layer that actually runs enterprises. The decision traces, the exceptions, overrides, precedents, and cross-system context that currently live in Slack threads, deal desk conversations, escalation calls, and people's heads. This is the distinction that matters. Rules tell an agent what should happen in general. Use official ARR for reporting. Decision traces capture what happened in this specific case. Quote, we used X definition under policy version 3.2 with a VP exception based on precedent Z, and here's what we changed, end quote. Agents don't just need rules. They need access to the decision traces that show how rules were applied in the past, where exceptions were granted, how conflicts were resolved, who approved what, and which precedents actually govern reality. This is where systems of agents, startups, have a structural advantage. They sit in the execution path. They see the full context at decision time. What inputs were gathered across systems, what policy was evaluated, what exception route was invoked, who approved, and what state was written. If you persist those traces, you get something that doesn't exist in most enterprises today, a queryable record of how decisions were made. We call the accumulated structure formed by those traces a context graph, not the model's chain of thought, but a living record of decision traces stitched across entities and time. But a living record of decision traces stitched across entities and time. So precedent becomes searchable. Over time, a context graph becomes a real source of truth for autonomy because it explains not just what happened, but why it was allowed to happen. The core question isn't whether existing systems of record survive. It's whether entirely new ones emerge. Systems of record for decisions, not just objects, and whether those become the next trillion-dollar platforms. What systems of record don't capture? Agents are shipping into real workflows. Contract review, quote to cash, support resolution, and teams are hitting a wall that governance alone can't solve. The wall isn't missing data. It's missing decision traces. Agents run into the same ambiguity humans resolve every day with judgment and organizational memory. But the inputs to those judgments aren't stored as durable artifacts. Specifically, exception logo that lives in people's heads. We always give healthcare companies an extra 10% because their procurement cycles are brutal. That's not in the CRM. It's tribal knowledge passed down through onboarding and side conversations. Precedent from past decisions. We structured a similar deal for company X last quarter. We should be consistent. No system links those two deals or records why the structure was chosen. Cross-system synthesis. The support lead checks the customer's ARR in Salesforce, sees two open escalations in Zendesk, reads a Slack thread flagging churn risk, and decides to escalate. That synthesis happens in their head. The ticket just says escalated to tier 3. Approval chains that happen outside systems. A VP approves a discount on a Zoom call or in a Slack DM. The opportunity record shows the final price. It doesn't show who approved the deviation or why. This is what never captured means. Not that the data is dirty or siloed, but that the reasoning connecting data to action was never treated as data in the first place. The context graph is the enduring layer. When startups instrument the agent orchestration layer to emit a decision trace on every run, they get something enterprises almost never have today: a structured, replayable history of how context turned into action. What does this look like in practice? A renewal agent proposes a 20% discount. Policy caps renewals at 10% unless a service impact exception is approved. The agent pulls 3 SEV1 incidents from PagerDuty and open cancel unless fixed escalation in Zendesk, and the prior renewal thread where a VP approved a similar exception last quarter. It routes the exception to finance. Finance approves. The CRM ends up with one fact: 20% discount. Once you have decision records, the why becomes first-class data. Over time, these records naturally form a context graph. The entities the business already cares about: accounts, renewals, tickets, incidents, policies, approvers, agents, agent ones, connected by decision events, the moment that matter, and why links. Companies can now audit and debug autonomy and turn exceptions into precedent instead of relearning the same edge case in Slack every quarter. The feedback loop is what makes this compound. Captures decision traces, become searchable precedent, and every automated decision adds another trace to the graph. None of this requires full autonomy on day one. It starts with human in the loop. The agent proposes, gathers context, routes approvals and records, records the trace. Over time, as similar cases repeat, more of the path can be automated because the system has a structured library of prior decisions and exceptions. Even when a human still makes the call, the graph keeps growing because the workflow layer captures the inputs, approval, and rationale as durable precedent instead of letting it die in Slack. Why incumbents can't build a context graph. Paul is optimistic that existing players evolve into this architecture. Warehouses become truth registries, while CRMs become state machines with APIs. His is a narrative of evolution, not replacement. That might work for making existing data more accessible. It doesn't work for capturing decision traces. Operational incumbents are siloed and prioritize current state. Salesforce is pushing Agentforce. ServiceNow has Now Assist, and Workday is building agents for HR. Their pitch is, we have the data, now we add the intelligence. But these agents inherit their parents' architectural limitations. Salesforce is built on current state storage. It knows what the opportunity looks like now, not what it looked like when the decision was made. When a discount gets approved, the context that justified it isn't preserved. You can't replay the state of the world at decision time, which means you can't audit the decision, learn from it, or use it as precedent. They also inherit the parents' blind spots. A support escalation doesn't live in Zendesk alone. It depends on customer tier from the CRM, SLA terms from billing, recent outages from PagerDuty, and the Slack thread flagging churn risk. No incumbent sees this because no incumbent sits in the cross-system path. The warehouse players have a different problem. They're in the read path, not in the write path. Ball positions Snowflake and Databricks as a truth registry layer. Both are leaning in. Snowflake pushing Cortex and acquiring Streamlit. Databricks acquiring Neon and launching Lakebase and Agentbricks. The pitch: data platforms replace systems of record and become the foundation for AI agents. Warehouses do have a time-based view. You can query historical snapshots, track how metrics changed, and compare state across periods. But warehouses receive data via ETL after decisions are made. By the time data lands in Snowflake, the decision context is gone. A system that only sees reads after the fact can't be the system of record for decision lineage. It could tell you what happened, but it can't tell you why. Databricks is further along in putting the pieces together, but being close to where agents get built isn't the same as being in the execution path where decisions happen. Systems of agents, startups, have a structural advantage. They're in the orchestration. When an agent triages an escalation, responds to an incident, or decides on a discount, it pulls context from multiple systems, evaluates rules, resolves conflicts, and acts. The orchestration layer sees the full picture. What inputs were gathered, what policies applied, what exceptions were granted, and why. Because it's executing the workflow, it could capture the context at decision time, not after the fact via ETL, but in the moment as a first class record. That's the context graph, and that will be the single most valuable asset for companies in the era of AI. Incumbents will fight back. They'll try acquisitions to bolt on orchestration capabilities. They'll lock down APIs and adopt egress fees to make data extraction expensive. The same playbook hyperscalers used. They'll build their own agent frameworks and keep everything in our ecosystem narratives. But capturing decision traces requires being in the execution path at commit time, not bolting on governance after the fact. Incumbents can make extraction harder, but they can't insert themselves into an orchestration layer they were never a part of. 3 paths for startups. Systems of agent startups will take different paths, each of which has its own trade-offs. Some will replace systems of record from day one, a CRM or ERP built around agentic execution, with event source state and policy capture native to the architecture. This is hard because incumbents are entrenched, but it will become viable at transition moments. Of the many startups going after the AI SDR category, Reggie has chosen to build an AI native sales engagement platform to replace legacy platforms like Outreach, SalesLoft, which were designed for humans executing sequences across a fragmented toolchain. Reggie is designed for a mixed team where the agent is a first-class actor. It could prospect, generate outreach, run follow-ups, handle routing, and escalate to humans. Some will replace modules rather than entire systems. These startups target specific sub-workflows where exceptions and approvals concentrate and become the system of record for those decisions while syncing final state back to the incumbent. Maximore is doing this in finance, automating cash, close management, and core accounting workflows without ripping out the GL. The ERP remains the ledger, but Maximore becomes a source of truth where reconciliation logic lives. Some will create entirely new systems of record. These startups start as orchestration layers, but they persist what enterprises never systematically stored, the decision-making trace. Over time, that replayable lineage becomes the authoritative artifact. The agent layer stops being just automation and becomes the place the business goes to answer, why did we do that? Player zero exemplifies this pattern. Production engineering sits at the intersection of SRE, support, QA, and dev. Classic glue function where humans carry context that software doesn't capture. Player zero starts by automating L2, L3 support, but the real asset is the context graph it builds, a living model of how code, config, infrastructure, and customer behavior interact in reality. That graph becomes a source of truth for why did this break and will this change break production? Questions no existing systems can answer. As startups pursue these paths, observability for agents will become critical infrastructure. As decision traces accumulate, context graphs grow. Enterprises will need to monitor, debug, and evaluate agent behavior at scale. Arise is building the observability layer for this new stack, giving teams visibility into how agents reason, where they fail, and how their decisions perform over time. Just as Datadog became essential infrastructure for monitoring applications, Arise is positioned to become essential infrastructure for monitoring and improving agent decision quality. Key signals for founders. The signals for where to build overlap, but they aren't identical. 2 signals apply to all 3 opportunities. High headcount. If a company has 50 people doing a workflow manually, running tickets, triaging requests, or reconciling data between systems, that's a signal. The labor exists because the decision logic is too complex to automate with traditional tools. Exception-heavy decisions. Routine deterministic workflows don't need decision lineage. The agent just executes. The interesting surfaces are where the logic is complex, where precedent matters, and where it depends is the honest answers. Think use cases like deal desks, underwriting, compliance reviews, and escalation management. One signal points specifically to new system of record opportunities, organizations that exist as the intersection of systems. RevOps exists because someone has to reconcile sales, finance, marketing, and customer success. DevOps exists because someone has to bridge development, IT, and support. Security ops sits between IT, engineering, and compliance. These glue functions are a tell. They emerge precisely because no single system of record owns the cross-functional workflow. The org chart creates a role to carry the context that software doesn't capture. An agent that automates that role doesn't just run steps faster. It could persist the decisions, exceptions, and precedents the role was created to produce. That's the path to a new system of record, not by ripping out an incumbent, by but by recapturing a category of truth that only becomes visible once agents sit in the workflow. Systems of record reimagined. The question isn't whether systems of record survive, they will. The question is whether the next $1 trillion platforms are built by adding AI to existing data or by capturing the decision traces that make data actionable. We think it's the latter. Let's read this again. The question isn't whether systems of record survive, they will. The question is whether the next $1 trillion platforms are built by adding AI to existing data or by capturing the decision traces that make data actionable. We think it's the latter. So she's saying that the decision trace could be a wedge to actually expand upon rather than having the incumbents expand from the data side. And the startups building context graphs today are layering the foundation. Written by Jaya Gupta and Ashu Garg. That was an excellent piece of writing. So that was very comprehensive, citing some example companies in probably Foundation's portfolio, and also just being hyper detailed about what she means by context graphs. It was a rather long article, but I think it really covers a lot of spaces and probably is a reasonable article um, to read to get up to speed on the entire thought process behind context graphs and the entire set of data that Jaya and others have accumulated at Foundation Capital. So this is a really good read. So let me share my inclination and my thought processes from arising from this article. I think this is extremely correct. Decision traces do matter, but I think it is very non-obvious how you capitalize on this opportunity. I think identifying is very different from actually executing and winning. And so it is very non-obvious how, even armed with this information, how you sequence the steps from here. I think from one perspective, what I think is going to happen is that data companies are very well positioned, yes, as truth registries, but I think it needs to evolve from read-only systems to read and write systems. Just the underlying data infra for the entire organization, read and write and orchestrate. Having the orchestration layer as part of the data infra, as part of the platform that contains the data infra is quite important. And let's take a look at perhaps what I mean here. So I think an organization, a company is really could be seen as a collection of data, tools, basically software, agents, and humans. This is likely the brave new world of how a company operates. If we were to be very clean about this, I think you could really say it. A company is actually a collection of just data, tools, tau, and then maybe agents alpha. And agents could be humans or AI. So data, tools, and agents. Prior to now, software was quite hard to build and sell, but with AI, the cost of tool making is going to go down asymptotically to zero. So what matters is really the mode is the data, mode is enterprise data. So from that perspective, the canonical systems like CRM, HRIS, ERP, so things like Salesforce, Workday, SAP, this was really the sink for single source of truth, the canonical truth. And that's why these companies were very valuable, are still very valuable. And I think what's happening is that there's a race between incumbents, say, a CRM bolting on agentic workflows that begets the decision traces in Jaya's lingo. It's called the decision traces delta. And then you have, so these are the sort of the system of record companies going in this direction. Let's say this is scenario one. And then scenario number two, you have data companies like Snowflake or Databricks, let's say Snowflake, them adding agents and workflows, getting to the decision traces. Here, the advantage of the data companies is that they own the infrastructure. And so they could really expand from analytical warehouses, read-only warehouses into, say, something like a Lake-based where it's read and write, and then we could really store the decision traces in a nice way. Whereas the CRM companies don't natively have that infrastructure. So for an enterprise, for a pretty sophisticated enterprise, you don't want your decision traces locked in to our CRM like system. You probably want to have it in a place that is portable and you're not locked into a particular vendor. So that's decision traces as infrastructure is an advantage that these data companies have. And then for the system of record companies is they have the low friction and then the ecosystem lock-in effect that they have. And then there is another type of company that could win here, which is a workflow, basically a workflow company that bolts on either a system of record or data infra. So those are the three paths that we see in like platform domination here. And the advantage here for scenario number 3 is that there is no architectural baggage. And this is where a lot of startups are in, including Oxygen Intelligence. But what I think companies have to do is to really think about things from first principles in how to capture the decision traces delta. Let's think about this, how to capture this. And let's think about how to represent the traces. I think probably it needs to be in a graph form where the connections between the entities are the first class citizens. Because all that matters is that, well, not all that matters, but not only do the facts matter, but then the relationships between the facts matter perhaps even more than the facts themselves. And at the very least, I think you probably need a robust data system to capture the decision traces. So what matters is a system. Then so storage and compute, this matters. And then modeling. So representation matters. And as a meta point, I think setting a standard here will matter. So ecosystem really matters. Without an ecosystem of folks like adopting a standard for data systems and modeling, then nothing will ever get done. So from this perspective, I think if an incumbent were to win this type of battle, from my perspective, there are two companies that are positioned really well to win here. I think one is Databricks because they have the AI infra as well as data infra. They're owning all of it. And they're still led by a visionary research-led CEO, whereas Snowflake is perhaps having a Hail Mary moment in bringing on an AI native CEO that is more of an operator rather than a founder or a visionary. And then Palantir, yes, they also have this AIP situation as well as their own data infra, but this all runs on their ontology, which is their Palantir's own way of representing the decision traces and modeling the decision traces in a sense. So those are the scary incumbents in the sort of the ecosystem. And I really like the Palantir method of approaching this. But I think we must think from first principles on how to go beyond just the ontology. Think practically. So what do we say? What matters? We said what matters is data systems, modeling, which is a representation of the decision traces, and setting a standard. So it's unlikely that Palantir is going to set a standard in some sense because the ecosystem is so closed. I think you need to have an open ecosystem. And Databricks is much better suited for that. So the battle between Databricks and Palantir is probably a battle between Palantir setting a open ecosystem, well, building an open ecosystem. Doesn't have to be open, but adding on ecosystem, or Databricks adding on something like an ontology. So that's the battle at hand. From first principles, I think one likely needs a mix of an ontological system that is very much the representation of the truth, very firm grounding on how a company operates, as well as a more like random access memory like context traces. So I'll call this the context layer. And this includes things like memory and learned behaviors, etc. It really owns the data of the automation path, the workflow path, so on and so forth. And I think what could happen is the decision traces fall like this. Here are the set of decision traces, the DIs. They go into this waterfall. A lot of it gets absorbed by this context layer, the representation of the context layer. And then these things get hardened into the model of truth, the standard operating procedures, and also all the entities in the ontology. They get absorbed. So I think it's a hybrid approach where you have the context layer, which is a graph. Yes, everything is really a graph. Ontology is a graph too. The context layer and the ontology act in tandem to produce the best representation of the decision traces delta. So that's how I will think about the the players in the space, sort of like the scenario planning of how companies could go about in building this mega platform for AI. The system of record companies, the data companies, and then the startups. The important things, which is what matters, data systems, modeling, and setting a standard, what Databricks and Palantir are doing right now, and likely what is the best architecture to develop the system that gets at value capture. And so I want to end this um, end this episode with this sketch here, and perhaps we could continue this in the future and making things more specific and more concrete around these thought patterns.